Okay. This patch is called Melange because I was looking for a name of the patch and I remembered the trailer for Dune that I saw the other day. So, Melange is the spice in the Dune books series. I don't remember if it's mentioned by name in the trailer, but it allows you to see funky things. And so I thought that's kind of appropriate, / I can't think of anything better. So Melange is a 3 oscillator pitch track synth. You can use it with guitar, you can use it with bass, you could use it with the voice. Anything that produces a pitch that ZOIA can detect, Melange could be used with. I'm using it right now with a bass 6 because it's what I like to play. And it's set up, I think, in a pretty straightforward way if you're familiar with monosynth design. There are 3 oscillators. They all have their own on-off switches, so we can have all 3 on at the same time and form chords. We can have 1 on. We can mix in our dry signal too. The top switch controls the dry. And then each of these have their own level control. So you can mix the volume of each oscillator as well. They're all sawtooths, but you could change that if you wanted to. Each of the oscillator pages is labeled, so if you wanted to try out square waves or, triangles or whatever, it would just be a matter of going into the patch and changing the oscillator type. For me, I found that the saw wave with its rich harmonics stood out best to the sort of envelope filtering that I think is the other important part of this patch. So the oscillators are all the same with very few exceptions. Oscillators 2 and 3 have a fine-tune control, and that's mostly designed so that if you ran them at the same pitch, you could get a really fat sound out of them because they'd be detuned from one another. We could increase that. So they have a fine-tune control. I'm going to set that back to 0. And I'm just using the note numbers here because I find it easier to quickly dial things in using the note numbers. But the fine-tune control goes plus or minus 50 cents so half a semitone. And then if you press this button, what happens is that oscillator 2 is actually taken out of the mix and redirected to an FM input on oscillator 1. So we're not hearing a whole lot right now because they're the same frequency. But if we start messing around with that, we can get some interesting results. The FMing of sawtooth waves is not quite like the FMing of sine waves because it's a more complex oscillator or waveform. But you can get some interesting sounds out of that. So that's the mixer section. Oh, and there's a portamento control, which you can add to introduce slides between notes. I keep it at a low level sort of all the time because I think it makes everything sound a little bit more fluid. But you could turn that down or increase it if you wanted a more or less pronounced effect. The filter frequency is a lot like the oscillator frequency. So the oscillator frequencies just show how much that oscillator detunes from the pitch that's being tracked, right? So we can go down, we can go up, we can stay on the same pitch or come up with chords or whatever. The filter is also pitch tracked and slewed, it uses portamento too, so the filter will slide around with the notes. The filter frequency works like the oscillator frequency, so I can raise the filter above that tracking point. So when it's at A1, it's tracking an octave above the input frequency, and it'll sound brighter. And I can keep increasing that. So if you want a brighter sound, you can increase the filter frequency and it'll track higher than each of the notes. And I should add that the FMing, you can push this button on the page. When it's white, it's in FM. But you can also use the middle stomp switch. I forgot to mention that. Back to the filter. There's a resonance control. I've attenuated this control to try to give what I think is sort of the best range for musical resonance without getting, the resonance can add a lot of gain and shrillness, and this is sort of meant to cut off right at the point where it becomes, for me, in this sort of application, too much. But if you want more resonance, you can dial in some more resonance. The filters on this page that says filter. And then there's a low pass bypass, or not low pass bandpass switch. So the filter can be set either to low pass or bandpass. Low pass, the filter is lime, and bandpass, the filter, the button is blue, and you can change that with this stomp switch as well. These both work to do the same thing. And then finally there's an envelope depth control that's bipolar. It can go negative. Turn that back to positive. And it can go, much more pronounced in an envelope sweep as you keep pushing it. Let's do something fairly subtle. I'll turn it back to low pass filtering. And then there's an envelope section. The envelope section is, I think, pretty simple. There's an envelope shape control, and this uses the linear envelope shaping that I showed off in a video about a week ago for firmware 1.13. And the basic idea is that as this is closer to 0, the attack is shorter and the decay is longer. As this is increased, we get a longer attack and a shorter decay. We have an envelope time control, which we can set. This is attenuated to 6 seconds. So right now it's pretty short, but it can go up to 6 seconds, or you can use the left stomp switch to tap in a time for your envelope. And that can be anything up to 60 seconds. That's the limit there. And I generally use the tap tempo just because it's convenient, but you have both options there. The envelope can be set to exponential when this button is off, which is better for sort of percussive, whip snappy, lasery sounds. You know, particularly if I change the shape back to something that's more snappy attack. Or it can be linear, which will have a more even rise, so as opposed to something that quickly rises and falls. And those are just two different flavors of enveloping. I think envelope shaping, particularly on a filter, is one of those overlooked aspects of sound design. I think it has a huge effect on how we perceive sounds. So I wanted to put both options in there. I generally prefer the exponential option, but it depends on the application. And then the envelope can be looped to create an LFO. And since the LFO or looped envelope is still based on the attack of your note, it'll be sort of key synced. It'll always restart with a new note, which I think is nice for getting a sense of consistency out of an LFO. And again, we can use the tap tempo to tap in a new tempo for our LFO, and change the shape of it using both the envelope shape control and the exponential linear envelope control. And then finally at the bottom there are two controls that govern how the patch responds to dynamics. There's a gate. The gate has two purposes. One is to just eliminate noise when nothing is being played, but it also helps with sometimes the onset detector registers the release of a string as an attack. You know, so it works better if you mute with your strumming hand, with your plucking hand, but I don't. I generally mute with my fretting hand, so it can produce some unwanted triggers, but it also helps with the noise. You can set the sensitivity for it, the threshold for it there, and if you want to go into the more fine-tuned controls of it, I set it pretty aggressively, again, to eliminate these sort of double trigger sounds. So that's on the filter page at the top. And then there's a sensitivity control for the onset detector. You know, the lower that is, the less sensitive the onset detector is. I generally keep it on the lower end. But again, you know, it's something you can adjust to fine tune to your instrument and your playing style and all of that. The bass 6 has a pretty low output, so I think most basses, you know, would be even more sensitive to, and you might want to turn that down. But again, it depends on what your playing style is and what you want to achieve. So that's Melange. Let me just show off a few more sounds.